As stated earlier, many historians believe that the 1890s was the most tumultuous decade in our national history. And with such profound economic and social, political, and cultural turmoil and dislocation characterizing that decade, the particular event that served as an outlet for the state of upheaval was indeed the Spanish American War, which was declared in 1898. But even before 1898, the colonies of Imperial Spain, and this included Puerto Rico, Cuba, in the Caribbean, right? But even in Asia, in the Pacific, that is to say, the Philippines, which was, of course, a colony of Spain, these colonies were already being viewed as potential acquisitions to American imperialist and commercial leaders at that time. Let me remind you that at this time, America set its sights on being a global power in league with the great European ones, and that meant the acquisition of colonies at the time. And also, it was obvious that Spain was an empire on the verge of collapse by the late 1800s. Let's recall that they were the empire that actually sponsored and subsidized the voyage of Columbus in 1492, and they were the most dominant European empire during much of the ensuing centuries, right? With the Caribbean and what we call Latin America. Of course, it's called Latin America because of domination by Spain, right? Now, at this time, as I mentioned, this empire was dwindling. It was very weak. And in fact, in their various colonies, you see these wars of independence that I mentioned were happening as early as the as 1800s, the early 1800s, that is. And in Cuba, by the late 1800s, you see some Cuban nationalists rising in revolt against their Spanish masters. And in fact, they were winning this war of independence. They controlled the rural areas while the Spanish colonial masters pretty much only controlled like the big cities, right? The main cities, that is. So Spain was almost on the verge out of there. They were losing the war. And interestingly enough, at this time, American newspapers began publishing these sensationalized depictions of Spain as an evil empire. Okay, and this was called the Yellow Press, by the way. And let me move forward to the slide here. So here's an example of something from the Yellow Press, also known as Yellow Journalism. And on this particular magazine called Judge, it shows the Spanish brute, right? This creature here that's obviously bestialized. It's depicted as an animal more so than a human here. And this is depicted after the explosion of the Maine, the USS Maine, which was a naval ship docked in Cuba. But I'll get to that shortly. But what happens during this period um, is that Spain is depicted as an evil empire in the various magazines in order really to promote the war among the American public. And this is what yellow journalism accomplished. Um, a lot of this stuff, as I mentioned, was heavily sensationalized, but nonetheless, they achieved their desired effect in convincing most Americans that we needed to go to war against this evil empire. So here's an example. And here's another example that was printed in the newspapers. And this supposedly depicted on the right hand side these various concentration camps happening in Cuba, where we accuse the Spanish colonials as pretty much starving the natives there. Now, the one on the left is interesting because here you see the use of gender and sexuality in sort of galvanizing the public in their support against war against Cuba. What was supposedly happening here was that travelers going between both countries, the United States and Cuba, and I should say American citizens, Supposedly, the women were forced to unclothed, okay, before the Spanish officials there. So it was a violation, obviously, of their rights. Right? They were forced to become naked, and this was used as a way to again um, trigger this anger and to further convince Americans that they should march in lockstep, so to speak, in the movement towards war. And like I said, it was very successful in this regard. So this is the infamous yellow press, where, as I mentioned, things were sensationalized. It wasn't always 100% accurate, to say the least. But the desired effect here is, again, to convince people that a certain action had to be undertaken. And usually it was used in a drastic action, meaning war, right? Because how are you going to convince the broad mass of the population to go against war against Spain? Well, the key event here turned out to be the sinking of the USS Maine, as mentioned. So, this naval ship was docked in Cuba, and inexplicably, they had this huge explosion and it sank, right? And obviously killed American sailors aboard. Now, of course, the United States blamed Spain for this, and this is exactly the event that triggered war. And this is the Spanish American War by 1898. So you had that slogan, "Remember the Maine," right? So things like this were useful as a rallying cry to, again, galvanize popular support for this war. Now, this was a very quick war, and lack of time constrains our discussion here of military history. But it's just important to note here that the war was very one-sided, right? Spain really could not put up a good fight against the United States. But for our purposes of understanding, the theme in broad measure of expansionism, what's important to know is this: that during the Spanish-American War, the direction of America's imperial movement, their imperial thrust, was now pointed outwards beyond the continental boundaries, right? And particularly it's towards Asia and some Caribbean targets, namely Cuba and Puerto Rico and a few others. But as you probably know, Cuba will never become a colony or a state, and we'll discuss that shortly. But certainly Puerto Rico is still considered a possession of the United States, as we all know. Now, the second thing to recall here is that um, the terms for surrender for Spain, right, was exactly the transfer of colonies, of former Spanish colonies, to the United States. This is part of the conditions for surrender. So that's how we got these colonies. It was a doorway into becoming a colonial power. And so began the United States foray into overseas colonization with the annexation of these territories. So, what we are witnessing here is what I call the irretrievable transition, or irreversible change in the American outlook regarding our foreign policy. From isolationism, that is, our previous or traditional way or approach, towards that of internationalism and engagement. So the Spanish American War made the United States into an imperial power. And like I said, it would rival the major powers of Europe at the time. No longer was our country seen as this young country, right, just starting to come in its own. Actually, this marked our entry into the world stage now that the U.S. had its overseas colonies. All right. But first, we have to remember this: that just because the colonies were annexed to the United States, that does not make it automatically a U.S. territory or a colony, to be more exact. What had to happen, it had to go through Congress to be accepted as a colony. And let me talk about the Philippines in this case. Even before the end of the Spanish American War, in fact, when the Spanish American War broke out in 1898, um, just like in Cuba, you see in the Philippines, the Filipino nationalists actually engaging in their own war of independence against their colonial Spanish masters. And they were actually winning the war again, just like in Cuba. They controlled the rural areas while Spain was relegated to the urban areas. So it's very similar. Now, when war broke out in 1898, when the United States warred against the Spanish Empire as a whole, we promised the Filipino nationalists that we would basically liberate the Philippines from Spanish rule. And the Filipinos, the nationalists there, assumed that they would therefore gain their sovereignty as an independent nation. So, of course, we welcomed the United States into the fold when war broke out. We were happy to hear that, or they were, excuse me, happy to hear that the Philippines was going to be assisted by the United States. And indeed, I talked about, the Battle of Manila Bay. What happens is the American Navy actually is now engaged in the Pacific for the first time, pretty much in a major way, that is. They are bringing their fleet there, and they are engaged in war in the Pacific Ocean. And that's the Philippines, of course. So, again, this war was short, as I mentioned, between Spain and America. And as I also mentioned, the condition was for some territory to be annexed by the United States. But let me remind you that I just mentioned that the Filipinos assumed they were going to get sovereignty with America's assistance during the Spanish American War. But what happens is this: once the war ended, we, the United States of America, that is, began to change our mind. We began, in other words, to consider the possibility of gaining the Philippines as a colony. And this would mark our presence in the Pacific, in Asia, right? And this is what we were looking for. In fact, even back then, what was echoed by some policymakers was to transform the Pacific into, quote, an American lake, unquote. Okay, in other words, we want to establish a permanent presence in the Pacific because we consider that part as the area of the world that we could actually dominate as opposed to the Atlantic side, which was, again, dominated by Europe. So we're going away from the Atlantic side, and we have our sights focused on the Pacific. And I also mentioned previously that this is going to be the case for the 20th century, where we're always involved in the Pacific. Okay, but this brings about a conflict between the Filipino nationalists who already set up their own independent government and the United States, which began to reconsider their position and began to debate in Congress as to whether or not the United States should actually acquire the Philippines as a colony to be controlled by the United States. So this led to a great debate, and the debate was between the imperialists, who obviously favored colonization of the Philippines, versus the anti-imperialist. And the name of their group, by the way, was called the Anti-Imperialist League. Okay, so what we're going to do is look over a speech by one of the most prominent senators at this time, Senator Albert Beveridge, and he puts forth a compelling argument as to why the Philippines should be colonized as U.S. territory. And what we could do is look over the speech and kind of pick out reasons that he is adducing, reasons he's putting forth as to why it would be a wise move to actually gain the Philippines as a colony. So let's read through parts of this and pick those parts out. So he says here, Beveridge, Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever. territory belonging to the United States, as the Constitution calls them, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not repudiate our duty in the archipelago. We will not abandon our opportunity in the Orient. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God and the civilization of the world, and we will move forward to our work, not howling out regrets like slaves whipped to their burdens, but with gratitude for a task worthy of our strength, and thanksgiving to Almighty God that He has marked us as His chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world. This island empire is the last land left in all the oceans. If it should prove a mistake to abandon it, the blunder once made would be irretrievable. If it proves a mistake to hold it, the error can be corrected when we will. Every other progressive nation stands ready to relieve us. Okay, so let's look at this. And the important things to note here, number one, uh, should have alerted you that his mention of China's illimitable markets is very important. So he's saying that China has this unlimited market. It's there for the United States as an external market to solve their problem of overproduction. Okay, so hopefully that connection came to your mind, right? Foreign markets, again, as a source for, a foreign consumer market, and therefore to relieve the problem of overproduction. Now, he goes on to say that it is, in fact, a duty, and it's important to note that. We talked about the white man's burden, right? How it's a duty to do this. And he says, we will not renounce our mission of our race. So there's that racial dimension, too, which he'll make more clear later. And in fact, he will say that we should do this. We should not regret it, right? But we should be thankful that we have this opportunity, uh, that even though it's a burden, we thank God for it, for choosing us as his chosen people to do this. Okay, so here he's invoking, again, God and calling the United States as chosen people to colonize the Philippines. And interestingly enough, he uses this idea of regeneration of the world. Okay, so what he's doing is making reference to this lofty ideal that the United States could remake the world in its own kind, right? So this should hopefully bring to your mind the civilizing mission, right? To spread civilization, and in the process, you are regenerating the world. So in the next part, he talks about, you know, even if we make a mistake, we could just let it go, right? We could just correct it. It's easy. Um, and in fact, all those countries, and he's calling them progressive nations, but what he's really referring to here, to be specific, are European empires. They, in other words, are poised to take over the Philippines if we don't do so. So he's saying we should just grab it while we can before other empires do it. Okay, so that's the first part of the speech that we are looking at. So we continue with Beveridge's speech here. He goes on to say, but to hold it will be no mistake. Our largest trade henceforth must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. More and more, Europe will manufacture the most it needs, secure from its colonies the most it consumes. Where will we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. She is nearer to us than to England, Germany, or Russia, the commercial powers of the present and the future. They have moved nearer to China by securing permanent bases on her borders. The Philippines gives us a base at the door of all the East. So here, Beveridge is really focusing on economics and what we could call geopolitics. All right. And obviously, the economic dimension is underscored here when he mentions that, yes, European empires have their external markets. Where are we going to turn for our source of foreign consumers, right? Well, let's look at geography. It's going to be Asia. And to be more specific, it's going to be China. China will be our natural customer of what? Our overproduction. Okay, so that economic dimension looms large in Beveridge's speech. All right. And I just mentioned geopolitics. This is when geography determines politics and political action and relations. Well, here Beveridge, that is talking about how the Philippines could serve as a very important geostrategic center for American presence in the Pacific, right? The Philippines gives us a base at the door of all the East, he says. Indeed, that will turn out to be true because, we will gain the Philippines as a colony. And not only will it give us economic access to Asia, but the military bases in the Philippines through most of the 20th century, until they were dismantled in the 1990s, were the largest military bases outside the continental United States. They were located in the Philippines. So this actually became true. Okay, so we can move on to the second part of the speech, or the third part. He says, it will be hard for Americans who have not studied them to understand the people. They are a barbarous race modified by 3 centuries of contact with a decadent race. By the way, when he says decadent race, 3 centuries of contact, he means Spanish colonizers, because Spain colonized the Philippines for roughly 300 years. So he says, the Filipino is a South Sea Malay, put through a process of 300 years of superstition in religion, dishonesty in dealing, disorder in habits of industry, and cruelty, caprice, and corruption in government. It is barely possible that 1,000 men in all the archipelago are capable of self-government in the Anglo-Saxon sense. My own belief is that there are not 100 men among them who comprehend what Anglo-Saxon self-government even means. And there are over 5 million people to be governed. So here, he's dealing with race, obviously. He's saying they are a barbarous race. So he's setting up the civilizing mission here, right? He's saying how there's this way and that way, superstitious, right, dishonest, lazy, cruel, and so forth, right? And he's saying that, probably most importantly, he's saying that these people, these Filipinos, cannot understand the art of democracy, quote unquote, right? Because only the most advanced European nations understand the art of democracy. And this was actually a firmly held belief back then, during the 19th and some of the 20th century, that, persons, or let's say countries in Asia and Africa and so on and so forth, cannot truly understand, let alone practice the art of democracy. Okay, there was actually a belief back then called Herrenvolk democracy. Herrenvolk. It's actually a German phrase. Herrenvolk. And Herrenvolk democracy basically believed that only quote white persons, right, could truly understand democracy, let alone practice it. Okay, so we move on with Beveridge's speech. Mr. President, this question is deeper than any question of party politics, deeper than any question of the isolated policy of our country, even deeper even than any question of constitutional power. It is elemental. It is racial. God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic people. Teutonic means Germanic. Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world to establish a system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. He has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Were it not for such a force of this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. And of all our race, he has marked the American people as his chosen nation to final lead in the regeneration of the world. Okay, so we can stop there because it should be obvious what he's saying. In fact, this phrase right here, it is elemental, it is racial. He's saying at bottom, at root, this whole issue of annexation, sure, you could talk about economics, you could talk about geopolitics, but at bottom, it's about race. Okay? God has chosen us to impose this civilizing mission over this country, right? To bring them from this dark cave of savagery into the light of civilization, if you will. And this is why the Philippines should be annexed as a colony. Okay, so this is really what he's trying to emphasize here, right? It is elemental, it is racial. All right. All right, so that's Beveridge's speech. Now, I mentioned there was a critical mass of leaders and public figures, luminaries, and among them included, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, the African American intellectual, Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, Mark Twain, man of letters, and Jane Addams, someone we haven't studied yet, but we will encounter with the progressive era coming after this topic, and many others. Again, they're public figures, and they were against the annexation of the Philippines as a colony. Right now, many of them were opposed to it simply because it was at fundamental variance with our tradition of freedom and democracy. Because if you engage in imperialism, it's the exact antithesis, the exact opposite of democracy. And not to mention that, our country was born out of this anti colonial revolution against England. We were a colony of England. So it would be ironic, contradictory, if not itself, a travesty against democracy if we engaged in overseas colonialism. So this was the stance of the anti imperialist league. But needless to say, the imperialist league, which by the way won the debate, I already mentioned that, they won the debate, and therefore we gained the Philippines as a colony. But that would not be possible without this war, this very brutal war known as the Philippine American War. And this will be discussed next.